The simple request. The day began like any other for Sheila Carter. A mother of 2 young children, Sheila had become accustomed to managing chaos while juggling the needs of her kids, Jason and Lily. Today was no different. They were boarding a flight from Atlanta to New York, a journey that was supposed to be routine, uneventful, a chance to escape the stresses of daily life for a few days. The airport was bustling with activity. People hurried from one gate to another. Announcements blared over the intercom, and the smell of coffee mingled with the scent of airport fast food. Sheila, clutching Jason's tiny hand while Lily clung to her side, felt a wave of relief as their boarding group was called. They shuffled onto the plane, maneuvering their bags and navigating the narrow aisle to find their seats. Finally seated, Sheila took a deep breath. Jason and Lily, both under 7, were already squirming with excitement and a bit of impatience. She handed them their tablets, hoping to keep them occupied for the flight. The plane took off smoothly, and for the first hour, everything seemed fine. But then, Jason tugged on her sleeve. "Mom, I'm thirsty," he said, his small voice rising above the low hum of the engines. Lily chimed in, echoing her brother's sentiment. Sheila nodded, glancing around for a flight attendant. She spotted one coming down the aisle, a middle-aged woman with a professional smile that seemed practiced rather than genuine. Sheila politely caught her attention. "Excuse me, could I get some water for my children, please?" she asked with a warm smile, keeping her tone polite and patient. The flight attendant paused, her smile faltering. Without making eye contact, she gave a curt nod and walked away. Sheila frowned but told herself it was probably just a busy moment. She waited, expecting the water to arrive shortly. Minutes ticked by, but no water came. The children grew restless, their whispers of thirst becoming more persistent. Trying again, Sheila leaned into the aisle as the same attendant walked past. "Excuse me," she repeated, her voice a little louder this time. "Can I please get some water for the kids?" This time, the flight attendant stopped briefly and looked at her. Her eyes carried a glint of irritation as she said, "I'm busy right now," before walking away again. Sheila was stunned. Her polite request had been dismissed twice, with no explanation. Frustration began to build in her chest. Her children were thirsty, a basic need that should not be so difficult to fulfill. She looked around the cabin, hoping for some sense of support from the other passengers. A few glanced her way but quickly looked away, unwilling to engage. Jason's voice broke her thoughts. "Mom, why won't they bring us water?" he asked innocently, his wide eyes filled with confusion. Sheila placed a comforting hand on his shoulder and forced a reassuring smile. "They'll bring it soon," she said, though her heart sank with doubt. The next time the flight attendant passed by, Sheila stood up. Her voice was firm but calm. "Excuse me, my children need water. Can you please bring us some now?" The attendant's response was cold and clipped. "I've already told you, ma'am. I'm busy." Without waiting for a reply, she turned and walked away, her dismissive attitude making it clear that she had no intention of fulfilling the request. At that moment, Sheila felt the eyes of nearly everyone in the cabin on her. She sat down slowly, feeling a mix of humiliation, anger, and disbelief. Why was such a simple request being ignored? Was it because she was black? The thought gnawed at her, unspoken but heavy in her mind. The tension in the cabin grew palpable. Some passengers murmured among themselves, clearly aware of the exchange but unwilling to intervene. Sheila's frustration boiled beneath the surface as she weighed her options. She could let it go, try to soothe her kids and avoid further conflict, or she could stand her ground, not just for herself, but for her children, who deserved better than this blatant disregard. Taking a deep breath, she decided she wouldn't stay silent. This wasn't just about water anymore. It was about respect, dignity, and the example she was setting for her children. She resolved to escalate the matter, unaware of just how far the situation would spiral out of control. Standing up, the murmurs in the cabin had grown louder as Sheila sat down, her mind racing with thoughts of what to do next. She wasn't one to seek confrontation, but the blatant disregard from the flight attendant was gnawing at her. Her children, Jason and Lily, were growing more restless, their small voices asking when they would get water. The desperation in their eyes only strengthened Sheila's resolve. Sheila glanced around the cabin, hoping to find some support among the passengers. Most avoided her gaze, their heads buried in books, tablets, or turned toward the windows. A few looked at her with what seemed like sympathy, but none spoke up. It was clear she was on her own. She took a deep breath and decided to escalate the issue. Sheila carefully unbuckled her seatbelt and made her way to the front of the plane, where the senior flight attendant stood near the galley. The woman was busy organizing snacks and drinks, her back turned to Sheila. "Excuse me," Sheila said firmly, her voice steady but resolute. The senior attendant turned, her expression neutral but guarded. "I've asked your colleague multiple times for water for my children. She's refused to bring it and has been dismissive. I need this addressed now." The senior attendant's eyebrows rose slightly, and for a moment, Sheila thought she might get an immediate resolution. But then the woman glanced past Sheila, as if assessing whether this was worth her time. "I'll speak to her," the senior attendant replied curtly, her tone cool but not unfriendly. "Please return to your seat." Sheila nodded reluctantly and returned to her row, feeling both hopeful and apprehensive. The children watched her expectantly, and she tried to give them a reassuring smile. "They're handling it now," she said, though her stomach churned with doubt. A few moments later, Sheila noticed the senior attendant speaking quietly with the dismissive flight attendant. Their expressions were hard to read, but Sheila saw the younger woman glance in her direction with what looked like disdain. The exchange was brief, and both attendants quickly resumed their duties. Still, no water arrived. Sheila's frustration began to simmer into anger. How hard was it to bring a glass of water? She had made a simple request, not just once but multiple times. It wasn't just the refusal that bothered her. It was the message it sent. It felt personal, as though her family didn't matter enough to deserve basic courtesy. Jason tugged on her sleeve again. "Mommy, are we going to get water?" he asked, his voice tinged with disappointment. Sheila felt her heart ache. She looked into his innocent eyes and knew she couldn't let this slide. "We'll get it, baby," she said softly, though her words felt like a hollow promise. Sheila stood again, ignoring the glances from the passengers around her. This time, she approached the same dismissive flight attendant directly. The woman was pouring drinks for another row, her demeanor cold and unwelcoming. "Excuse me," Sheila began, her voice firmer now. "I've asked multiple times for water for my kids. Why are you ignoring my request?" The flight attendant straightened and met Sheila's gaze, her expression hard. "Ma'am, I've already told you I'm busy," she said sharply. "You'll get it when I have time." Sheila's breath caught. The blatant dismissal was like a slap in the face. The attendant turned away, continuing to serve other passengers, her back now fully to Sheila. It was more than disrespect. It was dehumanizing. "Excuse me," Sheila said again, her voice rising just enough to turn heads in the cabin. "I'm not asking for anything unreasonable. My children are thirsty, and I expect you to do your job." The flight attendant turned back, her eyes narrowing. "Ma'am, if you continue to disrupt the flight, I'll have to involve security when we land." The threat was chilling. Sheila froze for a moment, disbelief washing over her. Was this really happening? She was being painted as the problem when all she wanted was water for her children. The injustice of it all burned in her chest. The commotion had drawn the attention of more passengers. Whispers filled the air, and Sheila could feel the weight of their stares. She glanced around, hoping for someone, anyone, to step in. But no one did. Tears of frustration welled in Sheila's eyes, but she refused to let them fall. She squared her shoulders, her resolve hardening. "You can involve whoever you need to," she said firmly, her voice steady despite the lump in her throat. "But I won't let you treat me or my children like this. This is unacceptable." The senior flight attendant arrived then, her expression a mixture of annoyance and concern. "What seems to be the problem here?" she asked, her tone clipped. "The problem," Sheila said, turning to her, "is that I've been asking for water for my children for over an hour, and your colleague has refused to bring it. She's been rude and dismissive, and now she's threatening me with security for asking for basic service." The senior attendant frowned and turned to the younger woman. "Is this true?" "She's being unreasonable," the younger woman replied defensively. "I've been busy trying to serve the other passengers." "That's not true," Sheila interjected. "You've walked past us several times without even acknowledging my request." The tension in the air was almost suffocating. Passengers were no longer pretending not to listen. Some sat up straighter, their expressions a mix of curiosity and discomfort. Others exchanged uneasy glances, whispering among themselves. The senior attendant sighed and addressed the younger woman. "We'll discuss this later," she said curtly before turning back to Sheila. "I'll bring the water myself." Sheila returned to her seat, feeling both vindicated and exhausted. A few moments later, the senior attendant appeared with 2 small bottles of water. Sheila thanked her and handed them to her children, who eagerly took them and began to drink. But the victory felt hollow. Sheila could still feel the judgment in the air, the silent stares of passengers who had witnessed the exchange but done nothing to help. And then, as she settled back into her seat, she heard it, the dismissive flight attendant muttering under her breath as she passed by. "Not all requests are treated the same." The words hit Sheila like a punch to the gut. They were spoken softly, almost casually, but their weight was undeniable. It was a confirmation of what she had suspected all along. This wasn't just bad service. This was about who she was. Her mind raced with emotions: anger, hurt, disbelief. She thought about her children, who were now happily sipping their water, unaware of the deeper injustice their mother had just faced. Sheila clenched her fists, her resolve stronger than ever. She wouldn't let this moment be forgotten. As the plane continued its journey, Sheila knew one thing for certain. She would make sure the world heard her story. This wasn't just about water. This was about respect, dignity, and standing up for what was right. The cabin erupts. The whispered comment from the flight attendant reverberated in Sheila's mind. Not all requests are treated the same. It was more than just an insult. It was an unspoken truth laid bare, a glimpse into a bias that had followed her all her life. Sheila sat frozen for a moment, her hands gripping the armrests, her mind cycling between disbelief and a growing fury. This was no longer just about water. It was about something far deeper, something that demanded to be addressed. Sheila glanced at her children, Jason and Lily, who were now happily sipping their water, oblivious to the tension that had consumed the cabin. They didn't understand the weight of what had happened, and Sheila was grateful for their innocence. But she knew this moment wasn't just about her. It was about them. It was about ensuring they never had to endure what she was facing now. The murmurs around the cabin grew louder as passengers began to discuss what they had just witnessed. Sheila could hear snippets of conversations. "Did you hear what she said? That was uncalled for. What's wrong with that flight attendant?" But no one spoke directly to her. The silence from those who could have supported her was deafening. Sheila took a deep breath and stood again, this time with more purpose. She wasn't just going to let this pass. She carefully stepped into the aisle and turned to face the senior flight attendant, who was now busying herself at the galley. "Excuse me," Sheila said, her voice calm but firm. The senior attendant turned, her expression tight, clearly bracing for another confrontation. "I just heard your colleague make a comment that confirms what I've felt this entire time," she said. "Not all requests are treated the same. I need to know what you're going to do about that." The senior attendant's face paled slightly, and for a moment she looked genuinely taken aback. "I wasn't aware of that," she said cautiously. "I'll address it with her." "That's not enough," Sheila pressed, her voice rising just enough to draw the attention of more passengers. "This isn't just about me anymore. This is about how you treat your customers, how you treat people. I deserve an explanation, and I deserve accountability." At that moment, another passenger, a man sitting a few rows behind Sheila, stood up. "She's right," he said loudly, his voice carrying across the cabin. "I heard what the attendant said too. This is unacceptable." The support was unexpected, and Sheila turned to look at the man, her heart swelling with gratitude. He was in his mid-40s, dressed in a business suit, and his expression was one of firm resolve. "You can't just sweep this under the rug," he continued, addressing the senior attendant. "We've all seen how this has been handled, and it's not okay." His words seemed to spark something in the other passengers. A woman sitting near the front spoke up next. "I've been watching this whole thing, and it's been bothering me. She's just asking for basic decency. Why is that so hard?" Another voice chimed in, then another. The cabin, once tense and silent, had erupted into a chorus of support for Sheila. Passengers were no longer content to sit by and let the injustice play out. The senior flight attendant looked visibly uncomfortable, her professional demeanor faltering under the weight of the growing unrest. "Please, everyone," the senior attendant said, her voice wavering as she raised her hands in an attempt to calm the passengers. "We'll handle this situation. I assure you, the matter will be addressed." "That's not good enough," Sheila said, stepping forward. The adrenaline coursing through her veins gave her courage she didn't know she had. "This isn't something you can just address. I want an official statement from your airline, and I want to know that this kind of behavior won't be tolerated." More murmurs of agreement rippled through the cabin. The dismissive flight attendant, who had been lingering at the back of the plane, now stepped forward, her face flushed with a mix of anger and embarrassment. "I've already apologized," she said defensively, though her tone lacked any sincerity. "What more do you want from me?" "I want you to understand the impact of your actions," Sheila shot back. "I want you to recognize that the way you treated me and my children was wrong. This isn't just about water. It's about respect." The flight attendant opened her mouth to respond, but the senior attendant interrupted. "That's enough," she said sharply, directing her words to her colleague. Turning back to Sheila, she said, "Ma'am, I understand your frustration, and I assure you we'll be filing a formal report about this incident. If you'd like, I can connect you with our customer service team once we land." Sheila's jaw tightened. It felt like another brush-off, another attempt to minimize what had happened. But before she could respond, the man in the business suit spoke up again. "That's not going to cut it," he said. "If this airline cares about its reputation, they need to do better. People need to see real consequences for behavior like this." The senior attendant's expression grew increasingly flustered. "I understand, sir, and will ensure this is handled appropriately." Sheila felt a surge of determination. "I'll hold you to that," she said, her voice steady. "And I'll be following up to make sure it is." The rest of the flight passed in a strange, tense silence. The passengers who had spoken up earlier occasionally glanced at Sheila, offering small smiles of encouragement. But the dismissive flight attendant avoided Sheila entirely, retreating to the galley for the remainder of the journey. As the plane began its descent into New York, Sheila felt a mix of exhaustion and resolve. She had stood up for herself, for her children, and for the countless others who had been treated unfairly but remained silent. And while the battle wasn't over, she knew she had taken the first step in making her voice heard. The landing sparks change. As the plane descended toward New York, Sheila watched the city lights grow brighter, their golden glow reflecting off the Hudson River. The view was breathtaking, but Sheila couldn't fully appreciate it. Her mind was still consumed with what had unfolded in the cabin. The small victory she had achieved felt hollow, overshadowed by the lingering injustice of it all. Jason and Lily, unaware of the storm their mother had weathered, were giggling and pointing out the window, marveling at the sights below. Sheila envied their innocence, their ability to find joy even in the face of discomfort. For their sake, she forced a smile, determined not to let them see her frustration. The plane touched down with a gentle bump, and a collective sigh of relief swept through the cabin as the journey came to an end. The captain's voice crackled over the intercom, thanking passengers for flying and wishing them a pleasant stay in New York. The announcement was met with polite applause, but the energy in the cabin felt different. The tension from earlier still lingered like a shadow. As the passengers began gathering their belongings, Sheila remained seated, her hands folded in her lap. She wasn't ready to leave the plane just yet. There was still unfinished business, and she intended to see it through. When the doors finally opened, most passengers hurried off, eager to escape the confines of the aircraft. But a few lingered, stealing glances at Sheila as if waiting to see what she would do next. Among them was the man in the business suit who had spoken up earlier. He approached Sheila with a kind smile. "You handled that situation with a lot of grace," he said. "I know it wasn't easy." "Thank you," Sheila replied, her voice soft but steady. "It wasn't, but it needed to be done." He nodded, his expression serious. "If you need a witness, I'd be happy to give a statement. What happened wasn't right, and the airline needs to know it." Sheila felt a swell of gratitude. "I appreciate that. Thank you." The man handed her a business card. "Feel free to reach out. I mean it." As he left, Sheila's resolve strengthened. She had allies, even if they were strangers. She stood and made her way to the front of the plane, where the senior flight attendant was stationed, directing passengers off the aircraft. The woman's expression was tight, her professional mask firmly in place. "Excuse me," Sheila said, her voice calm but firm. The senior attendant turned to face her, visibly bracing for the confrontation. "Yes, Mom," she replied, her tone neutral. "I'd like to file a formal complaint," Sheila said. "Not just against your colleague, but about how this entire situation was handled. I'll also need the contact information for your corporate office." The senior attendant nodded, her demeanor professional but clearly strained. "I understand. I'll provide you with the necessary details." She handed Sheila a small card with the airline's customer service information, but Sheila wasn't satisfied. "I'd also like your name and the name of the flight attendant who refused to serve us." The senior attendant hesitated but complied, scribbling the names on a piece of paper. "I'm truly sorry for what happened," she said, though her voice lacked warmth. "We'll make sure this is addressed." Sheila nodded curtly and turned to leave, her children trailing behind her. As they stepped off the plane and into the terminal, she felt a wave of relief mixed with determination. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. The conversation that couldn't wait. In the bustling terminal, Sheila found a quiet corner to collect her thoughts. She pulled out her phone and began typing an email to the airline's customer service department. Her words were measured but powerful, detailing the events of the flight and emphasizing the blatant discrimination she had experienced. As she wrote, she noticed a young woman standing nearby, watching her with a curious expression. The woman hesitated before approaching. "Hi," she said, her voice tentative. "I was on the flight with you. I just wanted to say I'm sorry for what you went through. I wish I had spoken up sooner." Sheila looked up, surprised but touched by the woman's sincerity. "Thank you. It means a lot to hear that." The woman nodded, her face flushed with embarrassment. "I saw how you stood up for yourself and your kids. It was inspiring. If there's anything I can do to help, please let me know." Sheila smiled, feeling a flicker of hope. "Thank you. Just knowing people like you care is enough." The woman handed Sheila her contact information before leaving. Sheila added it to her growing list of witnesses, determined to build a strong case against the airline. Taking the fight public. By the time Sheila reached her hotel, her email was complete and sent. But she knew she couldn't rely on the airline alone to take action. She opened her social media apps and began drafting a post. With every keystroke, she relived the events of the flight, pouring her emotions into her words. "Today, my children and I experienced something I wouldn't wish on anyone," she began. What started as a simple request for water turned into an ordeal that exposed the deep-seated biases still present in our society. "I stood up for myself and my kids, and I will continue to do so until changes are made." She included photos of her children, their innocent faces a stark reminder of who this fight was truly for. Within minutes of posting, the story began to gain traction. Friends, family, and even strangers shared it, their comments filled with outrage and support. By the next morning, Sheila's phone was flooded with notifications. Her story had gone viral, sparking a heated conversation about discrimination in the airline industry. News outlets reached out for interviews, and advocacy groups offered their support. A step toward change. Days later, Sheila received a call from the airline's corporate office. The representative apologized profusely and assured her that the incident was being investigated. They offered her compensation, but Sheila refused. "This isn't about money," she said firmly. "It's about accountability and systemic change." The airline eventually issued a public apology, and the flight attendant involved was suspended pending further investigation. But for Sheila, this was just the beginning. She partnered with advocacy groups to push for better training for airline staff and launched a campaign to raise awareness about discrimination in customer service. Through it all, Sheila remained focused on her children. Jason and Lily were her driving force, the reason she refused to stay silent. She wanted them to grow up in a world where respect and dignity were not privileges but rights. And as she tucked them into bed one night, Jason looked up at her with wide, curious eyes. "Mommy, why did that lady on the plane not want to give us water?" he asked softly. Sheila smiled sadly, brushing a hand through his hair. "Because some people don't know how to treat others the way they should," she said. "But we're going to help change that, okay?" Jason nodded, his trust in his mother unwavering. "Okay." Sheila kissed his forehead, her heart swelling with pride and resolve. This was the fight she had chosen, not just for herself, but for every person who had ever been made to feel small. And she wouldn't stop until the world changed for the better. Rallying for justice. The days following the flight were a whirlwind for Sheila. Her social media post had gone viral, garnering thousands of shares and comments. Messages of support poured in from around the world, as people related to her story or expressed outrage at the blatant injustice she and her children had faced. Advocacy groups, journalists, and even prominent public figures reached out, offering assistance or asking to share her story. But amidst the flurry of attention, Sheila stayed grounded. Her focus was on making lasting change, not just for herself, but for others who had experienced similar discrimination. The flight had become a flashpoint, a single moment that illuminated a much larger issue. Sheila was determined to use the momentum to push for systemic reform, starting with the airline that had wronged her. The meeting. A week after the flight, Sheila found herself in a sleek corporate office overlooking the bustling streets of Manhattan. The airline's headquarters was a towering building of glass and steel, its imposing presence a stark contrast to the humanity of the issue she was there to address. Sheila had been invited to meet with the airline's executive team, who were eager to discuss the incident and present their proposed resolutions. With her was an attorney from a civil rights organization that had offered to represent her pro bono, as well as 2 advocates from a prominent racial equality group. The conference room was filled with high-ranking executives, their tailored suits and polished smiles doing little to mask the tension in the air. At the head of the table sat the airline's CEO, a middle-aged man with a carefully neutral expression. "Ms. Carter," he began, his tone measured, "on behalf of our entire organization, I want to apologize for the experience you and your children endured on our flight. It was unacceptable, and we take full responsibility." Sheila met his gaze, her expression calm but firm. "Thank you for the apology," she replied. "But words alone won't fix the problem. What happened to me is part of a much larger issue, and I'm here to make sure real changes are implemented." The CEO nodded, gesturing for one of his colleagues to speak. The woman, a senior VP of customer relations, outlined a series of proposed measures: mandatory diversity and sensitivity training for all employees, stricter protocols for handling complaints, and a new hotline for passengers to report discrimination. Sheila listened carefully, taking notes. While the measures sounded promising, she was skeptical of their implementation. "These are good first steps," she said once the VP finished. But I want to ensure they're more than just promises on paper. I want transparency and accountability." The room fell silent for a moment before the CEO responded. "We're committed to rebuilding trust, Ms. Carter. If there are additional measures you'd like to see, we're open to discussing them." Sheila took a deep breath. "I want to see regular progress reports on these initiatives, shared publicly. I also want a commitment to improving hiring practices to ensure your staff reflects the diversity of your passengers." Her attorney chimed in, emphasizing the importance of independent oversight to hold the airline accountable. The advocates backed her up, highlighting similar incidents in the industry and the need for systemic reform. By the end of the meeting, Sheila felt cautiously optimistic. The airline had agreed to her demands and committed to working with her and the advocacy groups to implement meaningful change. But she knew the real test would be in their actions, not their words. The interview. That evening, Sheila sat across from a well-known journalist in a brightly lit TV studio. The network had reached out to her after her story went viral, and Sheila had agreed to the interview on the condition that it focused not just on her experience, but on the broader issues of discrimination and accountability. The journalist began with a recap of the incident, showing clips from Sheila's social media post and reactions from the public. Then, she turned to Sheila. "Ms. Carter, your story has resonated with so many people. Can you tell us what was going through your mind during the flight?" Sheila took a moment to gather her thoughts. "At first, I was just confused and frustrated," she said. "I couldn't understand why such a simple request, a glass of water for my children, was met with resistance. But as the situation escalated, it became clear that this wasn't just about water. It was about the way I was being treated, the way my children were being disregarded, and the deeper biases that still exist in our society." The journalist nodded, her expression empathetic. "You've turned this painful experience into a movement for change. What do you hope to achieve?" "I want accountability," Sheila said firmly. "Not just from this airline, but from all companies that interact with the public. It's not enough to issue apologies after incidents like this. We need proactive measures to prevent them from happening in the first place, and we need to support those who speak out, so they don't feel alone." The interview continued for nearly an hour, delving into Sheila's personal experiences, her plans for advocacy, and her hopes for the future. By the time it ended, Sheila felt a sense of accomplishment. She had shared her truth with millions of viewers, and she hoped it would inspire others to stand up for themselves and demand better. A growing movement. In the weeks that followed, Sheila's story continued to gain traction. The hashtag #RespectForAll, which she had included in her initial post, became a rallying cry for those sharing their own experiences of discrimination. Advocacy groups used her case as a catalyst to push for industry-wide reforms, and petitions demanding accountability from the airline garnered hundreds of thousands of signatures. Sheila found herself at the forefront of a growing movement, balancing her newfound role as an advocate with her responsibilities as a mother. It wasn't easy. There were moments when she felt overwhelmed, moments when the weight of it all seemed too much. But then she would look at Jason and Lily, their laughter and joy a reminder of why she was fighting. One evening, as she was preparing dinner, Jason came into the kitchen with his tablet. "Monty, I saw you on the news," he said, his eyes wide with curiosity. "Are you a hero now?" Sheila laughed softly, pulling him into a hug. "I'm just trying to make the world a better place for you and your sister," she said. "That's what heroes do, right?" Jason nodded solemnly, and Sheila felt a surge of pride. She was teaching her children an invaluable lesson, not just through her words, but through her actions. The airline responds. A month after the incident, the airline held a press conference to announce the changes they were implementing. Sheila was invited to speak, alongside the CEO and representatives from the advocacy groups she had partnered with. Standing at the podium, Sheila looked out at the sea of reporters and cameras. She felt a mix of nerves and determination, but when she spoke, her voice was strong. "This isn't just about one flight or one family," she said. "It's about creating a world where everyone is treated with dignity and respect, no matter who they are or where they come from. Change doesn't happen overnight, but with commitment and accountability, it's possible. The crowd erupted into applause, and Sheila felt a glimmer of hope. This was just the beginning, but it was a start. As she stepped off the stage, her attorney leaned over and whispered, "You're making history." Sheila smiled. She wasn't just making history, she was making a better future. For her children, for herself, and for everyone who deserved better. The ripple effect. The airline's announcement was a pivotal moment, but Sheila knew that a press conference and promises wouldn't erase the deep-seated issues she was fighting against. Real change required vigilance and persistence, and Sheila was ready to hold the airline, and others in positions of power, accountable. In the days following the conference, Sheila's schedule became a flurry of meetings, interviews, and strategy sessions with advocacy groups. She worked tirelessly, fueled by the messages she received daily from people who shared their own stories of discrimination. Each message reminded her that this fight was about more than her own experience. It was about creating a ripple effect that would challenge systemic inequality everywhere. A community unites. One day, Sheila attended a town hall meeting organized by a local advocacy group in New York. The room was packed with people from all walks of life: families, students, activists, and even airline employees who had come to share their perspectives. Sheila was invited to speak, and as she took the stage, she felt a wave of emotion. These were the people she was fighting for. "Thank you all for being here," Sheila began, her voice steady but filled with passion. "When I boarded that plane with my children, I never imagined I'd be standing here today. What happened to us was wrong, but it wasn't unique. That's why we're here, to make sure these experiences stop being so common." The crowd erupted into applause, and Sheila continued, sharing not just her story but her vision for a better future. She emphasized the need for accountability, education, and unity. By the time she finished, the room was buzzing with energy and determination. During the Q&A session, a young woman in her early 20s raised her hand. "Ms. Carter, how do you stay hopeful when it feels like change is so slow?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. Sheila smiled warmly. "Hope isn't about ignoring the challenges. It's about believing in our ability to overcome them," she said. "Every voice matters, and together, we're stronger than the systems that try to hold us back. Change is slow, but every step forward is worth it." After the event, Sheila stayed to talk with attendees, listening to their stories and offering words of encouragement. She was deeply moved by their courage and resilience, and she left the meeting more determined than ever. Corporate accountability. As the weeks turned into months, Sheila continued to push for systemic changes within the airline industry. She worked with advocacy groups to draft a comprehensive policy proposal that called for mandatory diversity and sensitivity training, clear protocols for reporting discrimination, and independent oversight to ensure compliance. When the proposal was presented to the airline's board of directors, Sheila and her team faced tough questions. Some board members expressed concern about the costs of implementing the changes, while others worried about potential backlash from employees. Sheila stood her ground. "This isn't just about doing what's right. It's about building trust with your customers and setting an example for the entire industry," she argued. "Investing in these changes isn't a cost. It's an investment in your company's future." Her words resonated, and after hours of deliberation, the board voted to adopt the proposal. It was a hard-won victory, but Sheila knew the real challenge lay in ensuring the policies were implemented effectively. A national conversation. As Sheila's advocacy work gained momentum, the conversation about discrimination in customer service reached a national level. News outlets ran stories about similar incidents, and hashtags like #RespectForAll and #DignityFirst trended on social media. Companies across industries began reevaluating their training programs and policies, eager to avoid public scrutiny. Sheila was invited to participate in a televised panel discussion alongside corporate executives, civil rights leaders, and other advocates. The debate was lively, with executives defending their company's efforts, while advocates like Sheila pushed for more accountability. "What we're seeing is a cultural shift," Sheila said during the discussion. "Companies are starting to realize that treating people with respect isn't just good ethics, it's good business. But we have to keep the pressure on to make sure this isn't just a trend." Her words struck a chord, and the audience gave her a standing ovation. For Sheila, it was a moment of validation, but also a reminder of the work still to be done. Personal growth. Amid the chaos of her advocacy work, Sheila remained committed to her family. She made sure to spend quality time with Jason and Lily, helping them with their homework, taking them to the park, and reading bedtime stories. Her children were her anchor, reminding her of why she had chosen to fight in the first place. One evening, as they sat together watching a movie, Jason turned to her and said, "Mommy, you're like a superhero." Sheila laughed softly. "I don't have superpowers, sweetie," she said. "But you help people," Jason insisted. "You make things better." His words brought tears to Sheila's eyes. "Thank you, baby," she said, pulling him into a hug. "That means everything to me." Building a legacy. Sheila's fight for justice became more than a personal mission. It became a movement. She founded an organization dedicated to advocating for fair treatment and customer service, and amplifying the voices of those who had been marginalized. The organization quickly gained traction, partnering with other advocacy groups and launching campaigns to hold companies accountable. Through it all, Sheila remained humble. She knew she wasn't the first to fight this battle, and she wouldn't be the last. But she was determined to make her contribution count. As she looked back on how far she had come, Sheila felt a deep sense of purpose. What had started as a single moment of injustice had grown into a catalyst for change. And while the road ahead was long, she knew she was ready to walk it. A movement solidified. The day was gray and overcast as Sheila stood on the steps of a historic building in Washington, D.C. Behind her, a crowd of thousands had gathered, their voices unified in chants demanding justice, equality, and dignity for all. What had begun as a single moment of injustice on a flight had grown into a national movement, and Sheila Carter was now one of its most visible leaders. She adjusted the microphone in front of her and took a deep breath. The weight of the moment was not lost on her. She scanned the crowd, her eyes catching signs that read, "Respect for all, justice in service, and accountability now." These were more than slogans. They were a call to action, a rallying cry for change. Sheila leaned into the microphone and began. "Good afternoon," she said, her voice steady but powerful. "Today, we stand together not just to remember the injustice that happened to me and my children, but to fight for a future where no one has to experience what we did." The crowd erupted into cheers, and Sheila paused, letting their energy wash over her. When the noise subsided, she continued, "This isn't just about one airline or one industry. It's about a culture that allows discrimination to persist unchecked. It's about ensuring that everyone, no matter their race, background, or status, is treated with dignity and respect." A catalyst for change. The rally was the culmination of months of tireless work. After Sheila's story had gone viral, advocacy groups across the country had rallied around her, using her case as a catalyst for larger conversations about systemic discrimination. Sheila had traveled to dozens of cities, meeting with community leaders, speaking at events, and working with organizations to develop concrete policy proposals. Her organization, Voices for Dignity, had become a powerful force, partnering with civil rights groups and corporate watchdogs to push for reforms across multiple industries. They had developed a framework for mandatory bias training, clear protocols for addressing discrimination, and mechanisms for transparency and accountability. The airline where Sheila's ordeal had taken place had implemented many of the recommendations. Employees were now required to undergo comprehensive training, and an independent oversight committee had been established to monitor complaints and ensure compliance. The changes were a step in the right direction, but Sheila knew there was still much work to be done. Personal sacrifices. As the movement grew, so did the demands on Sheila's time and energy. Balancing her role as an advocate with her responsibilities as a mother was challenging. There were days when she felt like she was being pulled in 1,000 directions, moments when she questioned whether she could keep going. But every time she felt doubt creeping in, Jason and Lily reminded her why she was fighting. Their laughter, their curiosity, and their innocence were a constant source of strength. Sheila made it a priority to involve them in her work, explaining her efforts in ways they could understand and even bringing them to some of her events. One evening, as they sat together at the kitchen table working on a school project, Jason looked up at her and asked, "Mommy, are you making the world better?" Sheila smiled, her eyes welling with tears. "I'm trying, sweetheart," she said. "And one day, I hope you'll help me too." Conversations that matter. The impact of Sheila's work extended far beyond the airline industry. Her story had sparked a national conversation about everyday discrimination and how it often goes unnoticed or unchallenged. People began sharing their own experiences, creating a wave of stories that couldn't be ignored. Sheila frequently spoke at schools, universities, and workplaces, emphasizing the importance of addressing biases and fostering inclusivity. At one university event, a young black woman approached her after the lecture. "Ms. Carter, your story gave me the courage to speak up at work," she said, her voice trembling with emotion. "I've always been afraid to call out unfair treatment, but seeing you stand up for yourself made me realize I deserve to be treated with respect." Sheila hugged the woman tightly, her heart swelling with pride. "You do," she said. "Never forget that your voice matters." Opposition and challenges. Not everyone was supportive of Sheila's efforts. There were those who dismissed her story, claiming she was overreacting or seeking attention. Others accused her of fabricating the incident for personal gain. The backlash was hurtful, but Sheila refused to let it derail her mission. One particularly difficult moment came when a high-profile news outlet published an opinion piece questioning the validity of her story. The article suggested that Sheila's advocacy work was self-serving and that her experience was being exaggerated for media attention. Sheila addressed the criticism head-on in a public statement. "To those who doubt my story or question my motives, I say this: discrimination is real, and ignoring it won't make it go away. My fight isn't about fame or fortune. It's about justice, dignity, and creating a better world for my children and yours." Her response was met with widespread support, and the backlash only served to strengthen her resolve. A family's triumph. Months after the initial incident, Sheila and her children boarded another flight, this time to attend a national conference on diversity and inclusion. As they settled into their seats, Jason looked up at her and asked, "Will it be okay this time, Mommy?" Sheila smiled, her heart aching at the innocence of his question. "Yes, baby," she said. "It will be okay." The flight was uneventful, the crew polite and attentive. When they landed, Sheila felt a sense of relief and triumph. It wasn't just about the journey. It was about how far she and the movement had come. At the conference, Sheila was honored with an award for her advocacy work. As she stood on stage, accepting the recognition, she felt overwhelmed with gratitude. But she also knew the fight was far from over. A legacy of change. As the rally in Washington, D.C. concluded, Sheila looked out at the sea of faces before her. She saw hope, determination, and the promise of a better future. She knew the road ahead would be long, but she also knew she wasn't walking it alone. "Together, we've started something powerful," Sheila said in her closing remarks. "This movement isn't about me. It's about all of us. It's about standing up, speaking out, and refusing to accept anything less than respect and equality. And I promise you, we won't stop until we've made this world a better place for everyone." The crowd erupted into cheers, their voices echoing through the streets. Sheila stepped back from the microphone, her heart full. She had turned a moment of pain into a movement for progress, and she knew her fight would leave a lasting legacy. As she walked away from the stage, Jason and Lily ran up to her, their faces beaming with pride. "You were amazing, Mommy," Lily said, wrapping her arms around her. Sheila knelt down, pulling them both into a hug. "Thank you, my loves," she said, her voice filled with emotion. "This is all for you." For the first time in months, Sheila allowed herself a moment of peace. She had fought for justice, for dignity, and for the future, and she wasn't done yet. But in that moment, surrounded by her children and the people she had inspired, she knew she was exactly where she was meant to be.